everyone. I'm an attorney and policy manager here at INCOMPAS, and I'm here to introduce the next panel. So our next panel will be reforming the Universal Service Fund, which is everyone's favorite topic. So it's entitled Reforming the Universal Service Fund, How to Create a More Efficient and Stable Fund. And so I'd first like to introduce economist Paroma Sanyal, who is a principal at the Brattle Group, who will explore her recent study on the best path forward to stabilize the USF. And then following Paroma's presentation, we're thrilled to have John Hendel of POLITICO here, who will moderate a discussion with Paroma, as well as INCOMPAS's president, Angie Kronenberg, to further discuss a way forward. So with that, I will give the stage to Paroma.
Okay, thank you, everyone. If USF were a person, I know how it would feel to be in the limelight, because it seems like over the past, few months and almost years, that's what we've been all talking about. And last year in August, September, so the Brattle Group, Coleman Bazelon is my other co-author. We authored a paper on taking a look at USF and the funding and the best sources going forward. We'd had a conversation with Angie talking about, what were the various ways that were economically feasible and the best possible ways. And that's sort of how this paper came about. And the way I like to characterize the problem is like an open scissors problem. On one hand, you have the base funding contribution base going down, and that increases your contribution factor. And that scissor has been opening more and more every day. A couple of decades ago, the contribution factor was somewhere around 7-8%. And if you look at some of the projections, by 2027, it's going to be 50%. And that clearly, if not anything, calls for action. And then the question is, what next? How do we figure out what is the best contribution base to fund USF, which is such an important program? And when we were taking a look at this as economists, when we think of first subsidizing a program, one of the things we think about is, why do we subsidize a program? And the first thing that comes to mind is an externality, meaning it is something that the private actors don't take into account when they are making a decision. There's something more, there's a positive externality that is a greater benefit, and therefore there's other funding mechanisms of the government who needs to step in to fill that hole. And that's exactly what USF is. It's not just about deploying to hard-to-serve areas. It's also about this externality that benefits all Americans and not just sort of a few of them in a few places. And there are well-respected ideas in economics that talks about how do you fund subsidies. And the three broad principles that usually economists will talk about is, one, that your funding base needs to be fairly broad. Two, think about the sector from which the externality is being generated. And that's sort of the sector that you should look towards to fund a lot of this subsidy. And the third one is, whatever you do, that fee or tax ideally has to be as sort of least distortionary as possible. It really should not change the pattern of consumption of consumers. And guided by these three principles, we looked at various mechanisms through which this could be funded. The fee could be placed on broadband providers. It could be placed on things like digital revenues or edge providers. And not to give you a spoiler alert, but basically what we came out was that if you put this USF fee on broadband providers, that becomes your least distortionary way of getting funding for this program. So why do I say that? So think about first historically why USF was actually, what the intent was. Historically, the intent was to sort of deploy as much of telecommunications as possible, and hence, of course, voice services, right? Currently, voice services are only about 10 or 11%, whereas the rest of it is all broadband. So, and most of the funding that goes in 2021, I think about 65% of the funding actually went to broadband. Therefore, this is the sector that is generating the externality. This is the sector where the subsidies are flowing to. And it stands to reason, if you look at the historical context, that this is the sector that you should put the fee on, that should fund sort of the USF fees. The second leg of the stool that I talked about was it has to be broad-based and non-distortionary. So when we talk about something distorting consumer choice, what we think about is how price sensitive is a good. So typically you'll hear people talk about elasticities, right? So ideally, a tax or a fee should be placed on a product that is inelastic, meaning it's not price sensitive. So if you place a tax, a consumer will not change their choice a lot, which means you're not distorting consumer choice. And for broadband, it is usually an inelastic good, and if you do place a fee on broadband, it will not really distort consumer choice. One thing that I think I want to sort of be very clear about, no matter where you place the tax, you can place the tax on edge providers, you can place the tax on broadband, somehow or the other, the consumers will see some sort of a price increase. It could be on their USF bill, or it could be on some other product which, digital advertising is being fed through, or some other product is being affected. So the price increase will happen. It could be direct, it could be indirect. So there is no base that you're going to tax that's going to completely insure consumers against a price increase. Now the question is how much, right? I mean, if you put it on broadband, there's been a lot of talk about there's going to be a fairly large price increase, quantities between around $4 have been discussed. Just to put it in context, the problem itself is more complex than that, because you have to figure out, there are of course winners and losers, right? Those people who currently have voice service or even VoIP service, their bills might actually decrease because they are not paying as much of a USF fee. They're not paying like 35% on their voice bills. And countering that, if you do put broadband in the mix, what we've estimated is that the contribution factor goes down to 4%. So from 40 to 4% is a tremendous decrease. So on one hand, you have a decrease of, decrease to 4% on your broadband bill, on your voice bill, and then a slight increase on your broadband bill. And then you have to see where the two fall and which part of the consumers are affected. So it's not as simple as this is what an average number is. It's more complex than that. And I think last sort of where I would like to leave everyone with is even in terms of the pricing, we need to look at all the avenues, and we need to sort of look at the bias providers and them providing the funding versus sort of tech and edge before I think collectively policymakers can make a determination of where ultimately the consumer impact is going to be. And in terms of, people have also talked about if you put it on broadband, it might be a regressive tax versus putting it on other services. The commission and other policymakers have ways of ensuring that the low-income consumers are not hurt, things like the Lifeline program, or you could exempt some of the lower-income consumers from these taxes. So it doesn't have to be one broad policy that addresses everything. There can be a portfolio of policies that gets us to a good outcome for USF. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. John Hendel with Politico. And thank you for a strong start talking through some of the big issues there, Paroma. Okay.
They're capturing what your great questions and my comments.
Well, taking all of that, I wanted to turn to you, Angie, and kind of ask why you think this is kind of coming to a head now. I think we have seen the Universal Service Fund, dominating telecom debates over the last year in a way we haven't seen in a long time. But we've also heard about a lot of the reform efforts for many years now too. Why is this kind of coming to a head in 2024, do you think?
So it actually has been coming to a head for a while. If you look at the litigation that ensued several years ago, really challenging the USF, it was based upon the very high contribution factor that's being driven by telecom revenues declining as more of the providers allocate their revenue into the broadband basket, which doesn't pay in as compared to telecom. In addition, there was a significant effort by many of us in the room with the US Forward Coalition to really look at what's the right way for the FCC to use the jurisdiction that it has to address this really high contribution factor. And we did see this factor rise dramatically over a very short period of time. I like to describe to folks, I was actually at the FCC working for Commissioner Clyburn when I got the call, the USF contribution factor just hit 10%. What are you gonna do, right? And as a staffer who'd just joined her office, and yes, she was head of the joint board on USF, I was like, I don't know what we're gonna do. What do we do? And it turns out that the National Broadband Plan actually gave us a really good book to recommend we need to broaden the base. And the commission did have a notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on how to broaden the base. And they proposed a couple of different methodologies. And one of them was to add broadband revenues into the base. And what we've seen occur is exactly what I think, the authors of the National Broadband Plan at the FCC thought would happen. And that is more consumers and businesses are relying on broadband today and buying broadband as compared to voice services, which are the traditional telecom services that our revenues are paid in. So I think it's a combination of those factors, the higher contribution factor, a coalition that came together that really for the first time agreed on a path forward for the FCC to act, and then the litigation as well, really taking off this group that purports to represent consumers saying that the USF is unconstitutional, this rate is too high, court, you need to rein in the FCC is essentially what the cases have been about. And they filed in multiple circuits and have kept the FCC very busy defending the USF and kept many of the consumer groups also who've been defending the USF quite busy. So I think it's the combination of all of those factors that have driven the conversation and the need for USF reform. And then lastly, I should probably just say, the Infrastructure Act that grants significant funding to ensure every consumer gets connected to broadband now. And this is on top of other funding that came during COVID, as well as the rescue plan funding, the capital projects fund that Joey is working on. It's close to $100 billion that's being invested in broadband in the United States as a result of all these various funding mechanisms. And Congress said to the FCC, we need to evaluate how much USF we really need going forward. So that too, I think, has added to this conversation about what is needed. How much money do we actually need for USF annually to ensure everyone gets universal broadband?
Well, and one other big piece that I wanted to make sure to touch on was the Affordable Connectivity Program and what that role is in this debate, because I know that's something we've heard a lot about today so far. That's something that Joey talked about, Commissioner Starks talked about. I mean, that's something you talked about earlier, and it's not funded by the Universal Service Fund, but long term, I do keep hearing these coming up in the same conversation broadly going forward, and wanted to kind of ask how you see that connection. Is the ACP long term going to become part of USF? Is that something you're seeing as the inevitability after? Again, you talked about the legislation to appropriate a few more $1 billion for ACP, but after that, is it then potentially, in the USF conversation, does that need to happen next?
It's really interesting. Early on during COVID, Congress recognized that there was a significant gap. Low-income consumers were not connected to broadband like we wanted them to be, right? And it's something that we have been preaching when I was at the FCC for a really long time. Not only do we have to provide, the ability to have the network. Need to use the mic? Okay, thank you. The ability to have the network connect everyone, but they have to be able to afford it. And this became very apparent during COVID that there were a lot of families that still just could not afford broadband. I mean, we've all heard the stories, right, of teenagers and school children going to the parking lots of McDonald's and Taco Bell's and the library at night to get connected to Wi-Fi so that they could get their education. And this is why we saw Congress start the emergency broadband benefit, which became the ACP in the Infrastructure Act, a more, quote, permanent program, but not funded forever. And we saw Congress say, we're going to actually appropriate dollars. Now, the economists will tell you, like, the least distortionary way to pay for all of this is for the US Treasury to pay for it. So this is actually a really good thing that Congress was funding the Affordable Connectivity Program. But obviously the need has been so significant as we've seen over 23 million households take this program that now the funding is about to run out and we haven't even allocated the BEAD funding yet, and they were intended to work hand in hand. And we also heard Commissioner Starks talk about this ACP funding gives a revenue stream. It essentially guarantees low-income consumers can afford it, right? Which also helps the build case. In other words, it helps make BEAD more affordable. The BEAD dollars are going to stretch further. So this is really, really important information of how we how we make broadband more affordable for everyone. But as the ACP dollars go away, right, and they're going away fast. You heard that. They're going away by May. It's going to be done. So what do we need? We need Congress to move. INCOMPAS has endorsed the ACP Extension Act, $7 billion of funding that the FCC would have immediate access to be able to keep all of these families connected. This has got to be the way forward. It's the only piece of legislation that has any shot of passing both houses of Congress and getting signed by the president. I know there are some who think that USF reform can happen in the next 6 weeks, and I have to tell you, that's just not going to happen. USF reform is like rewriting the 1996 Telecom Act. So guys, I worked on the 94 Telecom Act, didn't pass in 94, right? And I was a young law student back then, and I was told, how many Congresses into the 96 Act we were at that point before it actually passed. It's going to take a lot of effort and work to completely reform USF. And there are a lot of different equities. So we've been urging Congress, you cannot rely on a USF reform effort to save ACP. You have got to give the financing for ACP so we can keep the program going. And yes, we can continue to talk about what's the appropriate action for USF reform.
Yeah, one thing we've also seen in the last couple months is the FCC beginning to sketch out kind of what different scenarios would look like a little bit. The chairwoman of the FCC, Jessica Rosenworcel, she had ridden to the Hill in January, kind of talking about scenarios in which, the ACP could be added to USF and looking at some of the different types of ways that, you could assess different services and what that would mean for consumers too. I mean, she really put an emphasis in the letter on what would these different scenarios mean for consumer bills. Paroma, I want to turn back to you because I was curious how you saw this letter from the FCC chairwoman. What jumped out at you when looking through this, and what role do you see something like that playing going forward as Congress and other folks are trying to kind of wrestle through how to proceed on some of these tough topics?
No, I think that's a great question because, and it's right what the FCC should be doing, evaluating various mechanisms. However, I think it would be great to have, being an economist, I'm biased, but great to have like all the economists in the OEA and the FCC involved in this, where they're really evaluating all the different brands of this. So taking a very sort of measured look at what will bias do, what will the real effects be on various sort of constituencies and finally on consumers, what will sort of the edge providers, if you put the fees on the edge providers versus the tech guys, what will that do? It would be good to see a more sort of even-keeled report that was focused on the economics and not on, it's probably easier generally to put fees on, say, big tech, where even if prices are raised indirectly on consumers, it's not directly on your bill. So it might be easier and more palatable. But ultimately, at the end of the day, whether the economic impacts and where the harm is, that's, I think, where we need to take a look at. And it would be great for the FCC to do sort of an in-depth study on all of these mechanisms before taking a policy decision.
I found interesting about her letter too is that I think she was actually saying that, but before she could do that kind of an in-depth analysis, she asked for Congress to give her the authority to do the in-depth analysis. So I think that there is a recognition in the leadership at the FCC that there's a lot that they don't know and what the market impacts will be based upon the different ways that you could expand the base.
Mm-hmm. Well, one other thing I wanted to be sure to ask about was the USF working group we've seen on Capitol Hill. That has been a big development in the last year. You know, you've got a couple of members of that speaking, I believe, later today. Despite the difficulties of USF reform, that is a group that's beginning those conversations. And, curious what you're hoping to see out of that, this year. Where do you feel that effort is now? And what are the things you're watching for when thinking about that? Curious if either of you have any thoughts. If you want to start, Angie.
Yeah, we were very fortunate that we had the opportunity to go in very early on. INCOMPAS filed comments in their working group, and then we had the opportunity to sit down and talk to them. And this followed testimony that I gave before the Commerce Committee, the subcommittee, where they announced that they were doing the working group. And I know that they've been doing a lot of groundwork and talking to a lot of people. And, I suspect that they are, working quite hard to come up with a framework. I think what's going to be really important is that there are many different equities of USF, right? And as I mentioned before, touching one part of USF may be difficult enough, but when you potentially are changing lots of things about USF, there are going to be many, many parties who are going to have a lot to say. And then whether or not something that could be a complete revision of USF can make it all through both Congress, both houses of Congress, and get signed by the president, I think is going to take a lot of time and will require a lot of political will in order for it to happen.
Well, and a lot of evaluation probably too of the different programs within the USF as well. I mean, there's been a lot of talk here about the contribution side, but I feel like you've also seen an appetite out there for kind of looking at those different programs, how they're working, especially if ACP becomes a part of that discussion. Is there any future combination with like the Lifeline program, for instance? I've heard folks bring that up in recent weeks.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. So there are 4 different programs in USF. I don't know how many of you in this room can name all 4 of them. How many of you think you can name all 4 of them? Okay, that's pretty good, more than I thought, right? And so as part of this review, they are looking at the 4 different programs and potentially what changes may be needed. One of the things that we emphasized when we were talking with the working group on the 4 programs is that we have a significant amount of investment that's being made by Congress through appropriations, which is the least market distortive way to fund things. And there needs to be a very in-depth review of what's needed going forward, right? And it's like, where have we now built connectivity that we can rely upon for affordable service? And then also, how much funding is needed, if any, for ongoing operations of networks that have been paid for by U.S. taxpayers, right? So these are hard questions. This is not easy stuff to figure out, and will require the FCC to really do a lot more in-depth analysis. And we'd really like to see in this effort from the USF reform group more guidance to the FCC of how they should go about and looking at this and really making sure that we're using dollars in the most efficient and most effective way.
Are you holding out hope of a legislative package moving this year? I know Senator Lujan has occasionally talked about getting one together, and they're looking through all that now, but
I think it's highly unlikely.
Yeah.
It's more likely my daughter is going to graduate from LSU in May than it is that USF reform is going to happen.
Oh. Well,
And she already has a job lined up. Yay.
Well, and you touched a little bit about, appropriations and kind of the neatness around that for certain of these programs too. I wanted to put forward the idea of what if more of USF funding was moved through the appropriations process? What would that mean? Because obviously we haven't seen that over the last few decades. Paroma, do you want to consider that a little bit? Because I know you obviously looked deep into where this funding had come from, considered all these different pieces in different ways. What would it mean if you were to move more of the USF itself into the appropriations process through Capitol Hill, which clearly is fraught with lots of different issues, lots of different spinning battles, become, complicated, for lack of a better word. But just curious what that would mean in your estimation when thinking about some of that.
Leaving the political issues aside, considering the fact that if this was an easy thing to do, then doing this through appropriations would actually be very ideal. Going back to sort of something I said about, the subsidies are for the externalities are for the entire society as a whole. So it's not just one person or one enterprise that is benefiting from it. And therefore, getting this funding to appropriation will ensure sort of the broadest and least distortionary thing that we could do. But granted, it's a difficult thing to do, and therefore we sort of take a look at these other routes for funding.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at how we prioritize ensuring that low-income consumers will have food on the table, right, can access healthcare, we actually have programs that Congress funds to ensure that those things happen. So when you have policymakers, and I do believe that we've seen a real shift by policymakers in the last decade to a decade and a half, where there's recognition on both sides of the aisle that broadband is no longer just a luxury. It is actually a necessity. You can't make a doctor's appointment and be prepared for that appointment if you don't have broadband. Sure, you can still call the doctor's office, but they're going to send you a link. I just went through this to fill out all the information, sometimes multiple times if you end up changing your appointment. Everybody needs access to that, right? I look at what my children have gone through in terms of their education, and they're both in college now. And even early on in their educational experience, we needed access to broadband as a family so that they could do the research and do their homework. But even now, it's even more necessary than ever before for students to be able to access online education. And earlier on in the day, we were talking about how artificial intelligence is really changing anything. And I thought Milo Medine made a really great point about how the studies show that students who get one-on-one tutoring really benefit from that. Their scores go up higher. And how AI potentially gives them the ability to have one-on-one tutoring. So tutoring where the AI is smart enough, knows what they need and knows what to emphasize. Guess what? You're going to need broadband to have access to artificial intelligence, right? So our society needs this. So Congress being engaged in this during COVID was great. During the Infrastructure Act, great. But don't we need a more permanent program, just like we have the SNAP program, to make sure people don't go hungry in the United States when they don't have enough money? So I think it is well worth Congress to be discussing this and what is the most appropriate way going forward and how this helps the whole economy across the board. I mean, that is what's so important for everyone to realize, is the significant savings that the government attains in the various programs when it comes to the delivery of healthcare and delivery of healthcare to low-income consumers, to the delivery of education, right? We need a much broader perspective, I think, than what I've been hearing people talk about this issue. And so thank you for bringing that up.
Well, and it sounds like there's going to be a lot more discussion throughout this year going forward, and lots of different wrestling with some of these issues. But I think we might be at time, but this was a great way to get at some of this, and definitely something that I'll be looking forward to covering more of in the next few months, and we will see where that lands us by end of the year. So thank you both.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you, John.
Thank you.